In the far reaches of the galaxy, where chaos ruled and danger lurked in every shadow, a nondescript bartender poured drinks for alien patrons, his scarred hands steady despite the turmoil around him. To the drunken guards who barged in, he was a nobody, a relic of no consequence. But they had no idea the man they mocked was once Earth's most feared warrior, a legend whose name had struck terror across the stars. Tonight, their arrogance would awaken a past they could never escape, and the quiet bartender would remind the galaxy why he was a force even armies had feared. In the outer reaches of the galaxy, far from the polished domes of civilized worlds and the watchful eyes of interstellar law, there existed a place that seemed forgotten by time. It was a bar ramshackle and unassuming, tucked into the shadows of a crumbling spaceport. The glow of neon signs and alien scripts cast strange hues across its exterior, their buzzing light barely penetrating the thick haze of smoke that lingered perpetually in the air. It was a haven for the downtrodden, a melting pot for smugglers, bounty hunters, and those with stories too dangerous to tell in polite company. Inside, the atmosphere was alive with a chaotic rhythm. Creatures of all shapes and sizes huddled around stained tables, their voices rising and falling in a cacophony of languages. The smell of spilled drinks, singed circuitry, and unwashed travelers hung heavy in the air. A dim, flickering light struggled to illuminate the scene, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. Despite the noise and the movement, there was an unspoken rule in the place: you didn't ask questions, and you didn't start trouble unless you were prepared to face the consequences. At the heart of it all was the bartender, a figure who seemed carved from the same rugged material as the bar itself. His name, for those who bothered to ask, was John Blake. A man with a face as weathered as the hull of an ancient freighter, he stood behind the counter with a kind of practiced detachment. His graying beard was thick but neatly kept, and his eyes, piercing but weary, watched the room with a calm that bordered on disinterest. To the casual observer, he was just another fixture of the bar, a relic of a life that had long since passed him by. Blake's hands moved with mechanical precision as he worked. He wiped down glasses, refilled drinks, and placed them on the counter without so much as a glance at the patrons he served. His movements were efficient, deliberate, and utterly unremarkable, just as he intended them to be. There was no reason for anyone to suspect that beneath his quiet exterior lay a history so violent, so extraordinary, that its mere mention could still send shivers through the galaxy's most hardened warriors. The truth was that John Blake was no ordinary bartender. Once, long ago, he had been a legend, a warrior whose exploits had shaped the fate of entire star systems. He had led human forces in battles against alien invaders, his strategies turning the tide in conflicts thought unwinnable. His name had been spoken in hushed tones by enemies who feared him and allies who revered him. Yet here he stood, pouring drinks for alien drifters and petty criminals, a man seemingly content to let his past fade into obscurity. The patrons never gave him a second thought. To them, he was just a man who blended into the background, his scars dismissed as the marks of a hard life rather than the souvenirs of war. They didn't see the way his eyes flicked over the room, assessing every movement, cataloging every threat. They didn't notice the way his muscles, though softened by time, still held the memory of combat. To them, he was invisible, a part of the scenery, as inconsequential as the bar stools they sat on. But invisibility was exactly what Blake wanted. He had chosen this life deliberately, retreating to the galaxy's edge to escape the weight of his reputation and the endless cycle of violence that had defined his existence. Here, among the forgotten and the desperate, he could disappear. He could be no one. And yet, as the night wore on and the hum of conversations grew louder, there was something in Blake's stillness that felt different. A tension that lingered just beneath the surface, a quiet readiness that had not dulled with time. If anyone had been paying attention, they might have noticed it. They might have wondered why this unremarkable bartender seemed so perfectly at ease in a place where danger was an ever-present companion. But no one noticed. No one cared. And that was their mistake. The bar's hum of activity was interrupted when the heavy doors slid open with a hiss, their rusted mechanisms groaning in protest. A sudden chill swept through the room as 5 figures stepped inside, their presence as oppressive as the metallic clang of their boots against the floor. They were alien soldiers, tall and broad, their armor gleaming under the dim lights despite the scuffs of countless battles. Their helmets were adorned with jagged crests and glowing slits where their eyes should have been pulsed with a predatory red. Each of them carried a weapon strapped across their back or holstered at their side, their bodies radiating menace. Conversations faltered, the lively buzz of the bar giving way to an uneasy silence. Patrons averted their eyes, retreating into their drinks or pretending to study the cracked screens of their devices. These soldiers were no ordinary mercenaries. Their insignias marked them as enforcers of the Selvar Dominion, a ruthless faction infamous for crushing dissent and exacting brutal vengeance on those who dared cross them. The Dominion had carved out an empire through fear, and these soldiers were its sharpest blade. The group fanned out, their leader a towering figure with jagged black armor and a helmet that resembled a snarling beast surveying the room with slow, deliberate movements. The soldiers' body language spoke volumes. They were predators, and they knew the fear they inspired. They thrived on it. One of them shoved a smaller alien out of the way, eliciting a startled yelp, while another overturned a table with a single sweep of his armored arm, sending half-full glasses shattering to the floor. Blake didn't look up. Behind the bar, he continued his work as though nothing had changed, his hands moving with the same steady rhythm they always did. He cleaned a glass, set it down, and reached for another without so much as a flicker of acknowledgement for the intruders. The soldiers didn't even glance in his direction. Why would they? To them, he was a nonentity, a man too insignificant to warrant their attention. The leader strode to the center of the room, his boots leaving dents in the metal floor. He barked an order in his guttural tongue, and one of the soldiers pulled a small, glowing device from his belt. With a press of a button, it projected a holographic image, a list of names, some accompanied by crude sketches or grainy photos. The device emitted a low hum as the leader began scanning the room, his helmeted gaze lingering on each patron in turn. Blake remained still, his focus on polishing the bar top as if the world beyond the counter didn't exist. The tension in the room thickened. Patrons began to fidget, their eyes darting nervously toward the soldiers and then away. A few quietly slipped out through side doors, unwilling to risk drawing the Dominion's ire. The soldiers allowed them to leave. They weren't here to intimidate the weak or punish the scared. They were hunting someone. Their weapons, though holstered, seemed to hum with anticipation, the faint glow of energy pulsating in time with their movements. Blake's eyes flicked up for a fraction of a second. He took in the situation with the precision of someone who had assessed countless battlefields. The soldiers were confident, arrogant, even. They moved as though they owned the space, their focus entirely on the patrons who squirmed under their gaze. Still, they didn't notice him. Why would they? He was just the bartender, an old man behind a counter, more a part of the furniture than a person of interest. To them, he was invisible. And that was exactly what Blake wanted, for now. As the hours dragged on, the soldiers made no effort to lower the tension in the room. They prowled the bar like predators staking their claim, their presence a dark cloud that suffocated any lingering sense of normalcy. The hum of conversation had all but died, replaced by the scrape of chairs and the clinking of glasses as patrons tried to appear invisible. No one dared to provoke them, no one even breathed too loudly. But Blake remained unaffected. His movements behind the bar were smooth and unhurried, his face a mask of calm indifference. He cleaned glasses, refilled drinks for those brave enough to stay, and silently replaced broken items without so much as a glance toward the soldiers. If he felt any of the unease that gripped the room, he didn't show it. The soldiers, in turn, seemed content to ignore him. To them, he was no more significant than the worn wood of the bar or the flickering neon lights overhead. Their focus remained on the patrons they deemed more likely to pose a threat, or at least those who might know something useful. It wasn't long before their behavior escalated. One of the soldiers, a hulking brute with scarred armor, grabbed a patron by the collar and hauled him to his feet. The alien, a wiry creature with pale, mottled skin, sputtered in protest, his hands raised in submission. The soldier leaned in close, barking demands in his guttural tongue, his glowing eyes burning with menace. When the patron shook his head frantically, clearly unable to provide the answers they sought, the soldier tossed him aside like a discarded rag. The alien crumpled to the floor, groaning in pain. The other patrons averted their eyes, unwilling to meet the soldier's gaze. No one moved to help. Blake's eyes flickered briefly in the alien's direction. His hands never stopped working, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, something so small it would have gone unnoticed by anyone who wasn't watching closely. The leader of the group, still standing in the center of the room, growled something in their language. The soldiers responded immediately, spreading out and continuing their search. Chairs were overturned, bags were rifled through, and patrons were shoved aside as the soldiers imposed their will with ruthless efficiency. Through it all, Blake continued his quiet routine, seemingly unfazed by the chaos around him. His movements were methodical, deliberate, and entirely out of place in a room that had descended into tension-filled disorder. One of the soldiers finally approached the bar, his heavy boots echoing against the floor. He slammed a gauntleted fist onto the counter, the force of the impact rattling the glasses behind it. Blake didn't flinch. He didn't look up. He simply reached for another glass, wiping it clean with a rag as though nothing had happened. The soldier lingered for a moment, his glowing eyes scanning the old man with what could have been disdain or perhaps mild curiosity. But when Blake made no acknowledgement of his presence, the soldier scoffed and turned away. It was a small victory, though none in the room recognized it as such. The soldier's arrogance had blinded him to the quiet danger lurking behind the bartender's calm exterior. The night stretched on, and the soldiers grew more aggressive. They barked orders, knocked over tables, and threatened anyone who dared speak out of turn. Yet through it all, Blake remained the picture of composure. His indifference seemed almost unnatural, a calm that defied the tension crackling in the air. But beneath his quiet exterior, something was shifting. Blake's sharp mind, honed by years of battle, had already begun analyzing the situation. He noted the positions of each soldier, the weapons they carried, and the patterns of their movements. He assessed the exits, calculated the distances, and formulated contingencies, all without breaking the facade of the unassuming bartender. The soldiers didn't notice. They were too caught up in their performance of power, too certain of their dominance to see the storm brewing behind the bar. But Blake knew. He knew it was only a matter of time. The night wore on, and the soldiers' frustrations began to mount. Their search had yielded nothing but frightened patrons and overturned furniture, and their leader was growing impatient. His movements became sharper, his commands louder, as if he could will the answers he sought into existence. The bar, now nearly empty save for a few stragglers and the bartender, felt as though it were holding its breath. Blake, as always, remained unaffected. His hands moved in a steady rhythm, cleaning the same glass long after it was spotless, his gaze fixed on some distant point. To anyone paying attention, his calmness might have seemed strange, even unsettling. But no one was. Not the soldiers who dismissed him as beneath their notice, and not the patrons who were too consumed by fear to question anything beyond their immediate survival. The leader of the soldiers, a hulking figure with jagged black armor that seemed to absorb the dim light around him, turned his attention to the bar. He strode forward with slow, deliberate steps, his boots leaving a faint metallic echo in the tense silence. The remaining patrons shrank back, their eyes darting toward Blake, hoping against hope that the bartender would find a way to de-escalate the situation. Blake did not look up. He continued polishing the glass in his hands, his movements steady and unhurried. The leader stopped directly in front of the bar. His helmeted gaze bore down on Blake, the glowing slits of his eyes pulsing faintly. For a long moment, he simply stood there, as if expecting the bartender to acknowledge him. When Blake didn't, the leader raised a gauntleted hand and slammed it down onto the counter. The impact reverberated through the room, causing the few remaining patrons to flinch. Blake's hands paused for a fraction of a second, so briefly that it was almost imperceptible before resuming their work. The leader tilted his head, the motion slow and deliberate, as if studying the old man before him. There was something in his posture that hinted at a growing irritation, a sense that he was being mocked. To a soldier of his stature, accustomed to commanding fear and obedience, Blake's indifference was an insult. Behind the bar, Blake finally set the glass down. His movements were deliberate, almost exaggerated in their calmness, as he placed the glass on the shelf, and reached for another. His eyes, sharp and unyielding despite their apparent weariness, remained focused on his task. The leader straightened, his armored shoulders rolling back, as if to make himself appear even larger. His subordinates, sensing his growing anger, began to edge closer, their hands resting on the hilts of their weapons. The tension in the room was palpable, an electric charge that threatened to ignite at any moment. But Blake's composure did not waver. If anything, he seemed even more relaxed, his posture almost lazy. To the soldiers, it might have looked like resignation, the submission of a man who had accepted his place in the hierarchy of power. But to anyone who truly understood the language of body movement, it was something else entirely. It was control. Blake was testing them, baiting them, pushing them to reveal the extent of their arrogance. He had dealt with men like these before, soldiers who believed their weapons and their armor made them invincible, who mistook fear for respect and silence for submission. They were dangerous, yes, but they were also predictable. The leader leaned forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over the bar. His presence was an unspoken challenge, a demand for acknowledgement, for fear. But Blake refused to give him that satisfaction. Instead, he reached for another glass, his movements deliberate and unhurried, as if the armored giant before him was no more significant than the grime on the counter. The leader's hand twitched, the faintest suggestion of a clenched fist. His subordinates took another step closer, their weapons now drawn. The air in the bar grew heavier, the silence broken only by the hum of energy blades and the faint crackle of their powered armor. Blake's fingers tightened around the glass he was holding. It was a small, subtle motion, but it spoke volumes. The time for observation was over. The soldiers had made their mistake. They had underestimated him. The moment arrived like a coiled spring snapping into motion. The soldiers, emboldened by the absence of resistance, pressed further into their display of dominance. The leader barked a command, his voice guttural and sharp, and his subordinates stepped forward in unison, their weapons humming to life. The sound filled the air, a crackling warning of the power they wielded. Blake remained still, his grip on the glass firm but unremarkable. To the soldiers, he was a man frozen by fear, a reaction they had seen countless times before. Their arrogance blinded them to the subtleties of his stance, the way his feet were positioned for balance, or how his shoulders, though relaxed, hinted at readiness. The leader reached across the bar with one massive hand, slamming it down again to punctuate his unspoken demand for attention. When Blake didn't react, the leader snarled, his frustration boiling over. His gauntleted fingers curled, and in a single swift motion, he grabbed the edge of the counter and yanked it forward, scattering bottles and glasses to the floor with a deafening crash. That was the moment Blake chose to move. In a blur of motion, his hand released the glass it had been holding, not to drop it, but to send it flying. The projectile struck the leader square in the visor, shattering on impact and momentarily obscuring his vision with a spray of shards and liquid. The leader stumbled back, roaring in surprise and pain, his hands instinctively clawing at his helmet. Before the other soldiers could react, Blake vaulted over the bar with a fluidity that defied his age. His movements were precise and practiced, the kind born of countless battles. He landed with cat-like grace, his boots hitting the ground silently compared to the chaos erupting around him. The nearest soldier swung his weapon, a jagged energy blade that hissed as it cut through the air. But Blake was already moving. He sidestepped the strike, his body twisting with effortless precision, and delivered a swift, brutal kick to the soldier's knee. The joint buckled with a sickening crack, sending the soldier crashing to the ground. Another soldier lunged forward, raising a pulse rifle that began to hum ominously as it charged. Blake didn't hesitate. He grabbed the rifle's barrel with one hand, yanking it upward just as it discharged. The blast seared the ceiling, raining sparks down on the combatants. With his other hand, Blake struck the soldier's helmet with a sharp, upward blow, sending him reeling backward. The remaining soldiers hesitated, their confidence faltering in the face of the sudden, devastating retaliation. These were men who were used to being feared, to overwhelming their opponents through sheer force and intimidation. But Blake's movements carried a precision and ferocity that defied everything they had expected. The leader, his visor now cleared, roared in fury and charged at Blake, his armored bulk a battering ram of brute force. But Blake met the charge head-on, sidestepping at the last possible moment and using the leader's momentum against him. With a deft movement, he grabbed the edge of the leader's armor and sent him careening into a table, which collapsed under the weight. The room erupted into chaos. The remaining patrons, emboldened by the sudden shift in power, scrambled for the exits, leaving Blake and the soldiers alone in the carnage. Bottles shattered, tables were overturned, and the flickering lights overhead cast erratic shadows across the scene. Blake moved through it all like a specter, his actions efficient and ruthless. His strikes were calculated, each one designed to disable rather than kill, though his precision left no room for error. The soldiers, despite their superior numbers and advanced weaponry, found themselves outmatched by a man who moved as if the years of peace had been nothing more than an interlude in a life defined by conflict. When the dust began to settle, only one figure remained standing. Blake straightened, his breathing steady despite the exertion, and surveyed the wreckage around him. The soldiers lay sprawled on the floor, groaning in pain or unconscious. Their weapons, scattered and broken, were useless now. Blake turned his attention to the leader, who struggled to rise from the wreckage of the table. His armor, once imposing, now bore the dents and scuffs of defeat. Blake approached him slowly, his movements deliberate, his shadow falling over the beaten soldier. For the first time, the leader looked up at him not as a bartender, but as something far more dangerous, and for the first time, he felt fear. The leader groaned, his armored frame struggling against the debris pinning him down. His glowing visor flickered, the once menacing red now dim and erratic. Around him, his subordinates lay motionless or incapacitated, their breaths shallow, their weapons discarded and broken. The silence in the bar was deafening, punctuated only by the faint hum of malfunctioning equipment and the distant crackle of exposed wiring. Blake stood over him, his silhouette framed by the flickering lights. He moved with the calm certainty of a predator that had already won, his steps deliberate and soundless. The leader tilted his head back, his glowing eyes meeting Blake's for the first time with something that might have been disbelief or terror. The leader had encountered formidable opponents before, but nothing like this. His mind raced to make sense of what had happened, to reconcile the image of the unassuming bartender with the whirlwind of violence that had just dismantled his squad. Blake's movements had been precise, his strikes devastating, and his reactions faster than anything the leader had ever witnessed. Blake crouched, his eyes sharp and unyielding as they locked onto the leader's visor. For a moment, the room seemed frozen in time. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken truths, the kind that needed no words to convey their gravity. The leader reached for his sidearm, a desperate move born more of instinct than strategy. But Blake was faster. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the soldier's wrist and twisted, forcing the weapon from his grasp. The pistol clattered to the floor, its energy core sparking feebly as it came to rest among the wreckage. Blake released the leader's wrist with a flick of his hand, letting the soldier slump back against the broken table. There was no need to strike again, the leader was already defeated, his pride and power stripped away by the realization of just how thoroughly he had miscalculated. The leader rasped something in his native tongue, a series of guttural sounds that might have been a plea or a curse. Blake didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence was answer enough, a stark reminder that the man standing before him was no ordinary opponent. Rising to his full height, Blake turned his attention to the rest of the bar. The destruction was extensive. Shattered glass and splintered wood littered the floor, neon signs flickered weakly, and the few remaining patrons had fled into the night. Despite the chaos, Blake's expression remained calm, his gaze scanning the room as if taking stock of the damage. He walked slowly to the center of the bar, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. Without urgency, he retrieved a chair that had been toppled during the fight, set it upright, and sat down. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, but there was no mistaking the tension in his frame. The leader, still pinned beneath the wreckage, watched him with wary eyes. He could sense the shift in the atmosphere, the way the room itself seemed to bend to Blake's presence. The man who had been dismissed as a nobody, a harmless old bartender, now loomed over him as a force of nature unyielding, unstoppable, and utterly indifferent to the leader's fear. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The leader's breathing was labored, his armor creaking as he struggled to free himself. Blake remained still, his gaze fixed on the soldier without a hint of emotion. Finally, Blake stood again. He turned his back on the defeated soldiers, walking toward the shattered remnants of the bar counter. He began picking up the pieces with steady hands, as if cleaning up after a particularly rowdy night of regulars. There was no urgency in his movements, no indication that he considered the soldiers a threat anymore. The leader, watching him from the ground, realized the full extent of his failure. This man wasn't just a warrior, he was something far more dangerous, a legend who had chosen to hide in plain sight, a predator masquerading as prey. And the leader had been foolish enough to disturb him. Blake paused for a moment, lifting his gaze to the darkened doorway where the night beyond seemed endless. Somewhere, out in the vast expanse of the galaxy, the echoes of his past awaited. But here, in this ruined bar, he had found a brief peace and he wasn't ready to let it go just yet. The silence in the bar was absolute, broken only by the occasional groan of injured soldiers and the faint buzz of damaged electronics. Blake worked methodically, collecting shards of glass and sweeping debris into neat piles, his movements unhurried and precise. It was as if the destruction around him was merely an inconvenience rather than the aftermath of a battle. The leader remained on the floor, his once imposing frame reduced to a heap of battered armor and regret. He watched Blake with a mix of resentment and grudging respect, his mind struggling to process how a single man had dismantled his team so effortlessly. He had come here seeking dominance, expecting compliance, but had instead found himself face to face with something far more dangerous than any insurgent. Blake finished clearing a section of the bar and leaned against the counter, his expression unreadable. For a moment he stood motionless, his sharp gaze drifting over the fallen soldiers as though calculating his next move. There was no triumph in his demeanor, no satisfaction at having bested his enemies. If anything, he looked weary, as if the events of the night had been a chore rather than a challenge. He glanced toward the doorway. Outside, the night stretched on, the faint glow of distant city lights barely visible through the dust-streaked windows. Somewhere out there, the soldiers' reinforcements were likely waiting, or perhaps they were already on their way. But Blake showed no sign of concern. Instead, he turned back to the leader, who had managed to push himself into a slumped sitting position. The soldier's breathing was labored, his visor cracked, his armor dented and scorched. He looked up at Blake with a mixture of defiance and fear, as if unsure whether to expect mercy or annihilation. Blake stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. He reached down, and for a brief moment, the leader flinched, his body tensing in anticipation of another strike. But Blake didn't attack. Instead, he grabbed the edge of a broken table and heaved it off the soldier with a single smooth motion, tossing it aside like it weighed nothing. The leader stared up at him, stunned. Blake met his gaze, his eyes cold and unyielding. There was no need for words, the message was clear. Leave now, and never return. The leader hesitated, his pride warring with the survival instincts screaming at him to retreat. Finally, he nodded a small, jerky motion and began crawling toward the exit. His subordinates, though still conscious enough to move, followed his lead, dragging themselves out into the night with what little strength they had left. Blake watched them go, his expression unchanged. He waited until the last of them had disappeared into the darkness before turning his attention back to the bar. The room was a mess, but it was still standing. That was enough for now. He began methodically setting chairs upright, righting tables and sweeping away the remnants of the fight. His movements were steady, almost meditative, as though he were erasing the traces of the violence that had erupted mere moments ago. In the quiet, his mind drifted back to the life he had left behind. The wars, the battles, the endless cycle of bloodshed and revenge it had defined him for so long that stepping away had felt like losing a part of himself. But here, in this small, unremarkable corner of the galaxy, he had found something resembling peace. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't permanent, but it was enough. By the time the bar was clean, the first light of dawn was beginning to creep through the windows. Blake leaned against the counter, taking a moment to survey his work. The soldiers would likely report back to their commanders with tales of a phantom, a force they couldn't explain. The galaxy might whisper of him again, his legend rekindled by those foolish enough to cross his path. But Blake didn't care. He wasn't interested in being a legend. All he wanted was his quiet corner, his humble routine, and the fragile peace he had carved out for himself. If others sought to disrupt that, they would learn the hard way that some threats should remain undisturbed. As the bar filled with the soft glow of morning light, Blake poured himself a drink. He sat down at one of the newly restored tables, the glass in his hand a rare indulgence. He allowed himself a brief moment of reflection, the stillness of the morning a sharp contrast to the chaos of the night. Then, as always, he let it go. The past was behind him. The future uncertain. All that mattered was the present, the quiet rhythm of a life he had chosen. And for now, that was enough. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Sci-Fi Horizons Stories for more thrilling tales of science fiction and adventure. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Sci-Fi Horizons Stories for more thrilling tales of science fiction and adventure. Keep exploring the unknown and stay tuned for more mind-bending narratives that will keep you on the edge of your seat.